this compassion that you can extend to non-human things is real. And I ran up into this limit of like what science was willing to believe in. It helps me to remember that I am the descendant of survivors, and I'm a survivor too.
Welcome to Unblocked. This series of podcasts is part of the Florida International University Commons for Justice, Race, Risk, and Resilience Mellon Grant Project, and on this podcast, we aim to discuss disaster exposures, vulnerabilities, and resilience from an Indigenous perspective. I'm Mitzi Uehara Carter, and I'm the director of the Global Indigenous Forum at Florida International University here in Miami. Today's guest is Dr. Brenna Kays. She's an interdisciplinary environmental researcher, urban social ecologist, educator, abolitionist, and creative based in Miami. She is a postdoctoral research associate with Florida International University's Institute of Environment. As a Brazilian American with roots in the Ribeirinho communities of Amazonian Brazil and descendants of enslaved peoples from Brazil's plantation culture, she brings a unique perspective to her work. Inspired by her kinship to the natural world and the mysteries it holds, she seeks to illuminate the intricate relationships between humans and nature within urban ecosystems. I'll be discussing the critical Indigenous methodologies she brings to her research and the way her Indigenous worldviews have shaped her love for the city and why she chooses to stay and fight. Is it a part of a rooted, radical, and Indigenous way of being resilient, or something else? Thank you, Brenna, for joining me today. Brenna Kays is a doctoral student at FIU in the Earth and Environment Department, and she is just about done with her dissertation. Hallelujah, right?
I can see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Right?
Yeah.
And she will be getting into her research and what motivated her to do that work here today. So I met you at a really interesting panel a few months ago. I think it was back in April, right? That the ever so resourceful Dr. Rebecca Friedman here at FIU, she's also the director of the Wilsonian Public Humanitarian Lab, WPHL, organized. And it was a part of a community conversation that was connected to an art exhibit by Catherine Hollingsworth. And it was also curated by Carl Just from the IPC Art Space here in Miami in Little Haiti. And I just want to read very quickly what he wrote about that exhibit and jump straight into a conversation, because it was really, I think that's why I was so struck by what you had to say there at that panel, and then before and after the panel preparation. So that exhibit was called The Secret Life of Plants, and that title was inspired by Stevie Wonder's 1979 double album. And Carl just wrote, the journey through the secret life of plants imagines plants as actors within our world, reflecting change, providing medicinal qualities, mirroring human life and death, and ultimately as keepers of the most precious parts of our souls, from our hearts to our consciousnesses. This exhibit highlights the interconnectedness of ecological and human experiences. The artist, Catherine Hollingsworth, herself migrated away from Miami to North Carolina because of the visible changes she found in the urban landscape of Miami, the overdevelopment and affordable housing crisis, and increasing threat of water and storms. And I think that exhibit really was a powerful one, but also really connected to your personal story as well, in terms of your feeling about loss and connection to this place that you call home now. And so I wanted to just kind of start by talking a little bit about your roots and your connection to this world of plants, but by way of your Indigenous Brazilian roots. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, so my maternal grandmother was a Ribeirinha, which is a traditional community in Brazil, literally river people that live amongst the Amazon River Basin and its tributaries. And my maternal grandfather was the son of enslaved people in Brazil, and they met when he joined the Brazilian Navy and was traveling in the Amazon region. And my mother grew up in Amazonian Brazil, in Macapá and Belém, until she eventually emigrated to the U.S. in her 20s. For some reason, I feel really weirdly deeply connected to my grandmother, who's a person I never met before. And when I came to FIU and wanted to start my graduate studies, I met my advisor, and she does a lot of work in the Amazon, mostly in the Andean Amazon, so the Western Amazon. But one of the groups she works with, the Kukama, which are in the Peruvian Amazon, have a worldview that when someone drowns in a river and their body isn't recovered, they live in an underwater city after death. And my advisor told me this story, and it was like a worldview I needed to hear, because my grandmother drowned in the Amazon with one of her babies when my mom was really young. And so it like shifted my world. And so now when I'm in Brazil and I'm with the river, I feel like I'm with them again, and with this person that I feel this unexplainable connection to her. But yeah, so I feel really deeply connected to the Amazon and waters in general. And Florida is so special because we have the Everglades, and I was born and raised here in South Florida, and I've always felt like most at home outdoors and with, like, nature is such a weird concept, but just outside, like even amongst my home, like in trees, falling out of trees and getting dirty and such. So yeah, that exhibition really struck me and resonated with me because, yeah, there's this critical connection that I think humans have with plants that Indigenous people still hold on to, and I think is like lost in. I've felt like I lost that experience a little bit living in the U.S., and I feel reconnected to that when I'm in Brazil sometimes. I don't know. I just was thinking about resilience too. Like when I'm back home with my family in Brazil, I feel very held. And here in the US, there's all this conversation about like this epidemic of loneliness and communities falling apart. And here in Miami, I feel like I'm seeing this happening in my community a little bit with changes in the housing, the way that housing is priced. And, I've had to put a lot of effort into cultivating community here in Miami, where for some reason it just feels like assumed back home in Brazil, and it's like culture of care is just ingrained. And moving forward, I feel like that like love and care are going to be critical variables for us in the face of uncertainty. Or that's what I believe. That, not to get biblical, but like loving my neighbor is the thing that's going to take us through, or I believe, and so much of this work is rooted in that too, like compassion and care for the people that live amongst me or live amongst us. And I just wanted to sprinkle that in.
I'm so glad you did. I think that is missing from a lot of our discourse on disasters, on risk and resilience, is that we completely leave that as an aside, right? And that's really critical. It's telling that, more anthropology conferences, for instance, are, there's whole sections, papers on emotional labor, on care, on, as really thinking about it in an analytical way of saying, look, this is something we do need to bring back into our analysis of all of these massive issues we're facing. So it's funny because you say, I don't know why I'm so connected, but I think for a lot of Indigenous people, we do know why. There is something like, and it may not come, at least for me and my own kind of story of my family, I think it comes to you in fragments, right? Especially when you are not living in that space where the rest of your family is located, and you find your way back to those deeper, soulful, feelings of being connected through dreams or through other kinds of pathways that are not always valued or acknowledged in our various academic communities, right? Or, just in general in non-Indigenous spaces. So I think that's such a powerful story. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's really something. And I can see now why that the panel resonated with you even more so now. I also think it's interesting, and for a lot of us who are multi-ethnic, right, myself included, and especially with one or two parents who have migrated to this country and had a ridiculously steep learning curve, we've had to kind of piece together these fragmented stories about our parents' lives. And sometimes their stories, their experiences, or their storytelling, rather, is stymied by a sense of great loss, or the silences are so piercing that we intuitively know that that's a no-go area, right? Or that they are themselves kind of sidestepping these really big kind of emotional traumas that can't be uttered, but we sense, right, in some way. And from our conversations, I've gathered that, your mom has had some sense of loss in her migration story, and you've been piecing together fragments of what it means to be Brazilian, what it means to have this Indigenous background. And I was really, really curious about your journey and trying to find her story and make sense of it. How do you make sense of it?
I think this is I don't have evidence for this, but I feel like maybe it's a common experience for third culture kids, that I know that my mother experienced great hardship, in her childhood and before her immigration to the U.S. And I have to be really mindful of the pain that's associated with her stories before she came here. And she's a person, I think, because of her past, who is really future oriented and is always looking forward and doesn't look back. But I feel like a deeply nostalgic person, and kind of assign myself this role of historian of our family. Mm-hmm. So it's important to me to remember, and it's hard for her to do that. So I need to listen deeply, or that's what I've come to conclude, is I need to listen deeply and be ready for the times when she's able to share things that are deeply painful for her. Mm-hmm. And those glimpses into the past come really often in the form of her expressing her empathy. She's a natural healer, just a healer by nature, and a immensely empathetic person, this wellspring of compassion inside of her. And when I was thinking about this conversation, I was drawn to this story that when I was a kid, she tended to plants and really cared for plants that we lived amongst, and would kind of taught me to speak lovingly to the plants in her life and sing to them. And I guess, maybe as a kid that felt really magical to me. And when I was in elementary school in Naples, Florida, this very white community, we sprouted beans in a plastic bag in our classroom. And every day I would go talk to my bean. And it's so silly, but I would talk to it and I'd tell it I love you and I'm proud of you and you're going to grow and I'm going to take care of you. And by the end of this experiment, or whatever you want to call it, in our classroom, my bean was the only one that had roots. It had a stem, it had leaves, it was flourishing when some of my classmates were rotting. And so it really embedded myself as this example of this is real, this compassion that you can extend to non-human things is real. And in my work as an educator, I have spent a lot of time working in K-12 education, and particularly environmental education. I've seen white botanists scoff at and eye roll when children talk about doing these types of experiments. We talk about citizen science and science education, and there are multiple times where students we worked with well, can we experiment with what playing music does for plant growth, or speaking to plants does? And I've witnessed we don't want to do that. That's silly. That's pseudoscience. I'm well, I don't understand the impulse to to discount love as a variable.
Ooh,
And,
yeah.
if something exists, it exists in some portion. And if it exists in some amount, then it can be measured. So, I don't know. It just felt like there was, I don't know, I ran up into this limit of what science was willing to believe in.
No, that's beautiful. Oh my gosh. Thank goodness that they had you as an educator with them to, be there to value their ideas.
Wow. The strongest voices usually get heard, and sometimes those aren't people that look like us. And I don't know. So as far as my mom, I feel like her compassion and her gift for healing are just boundless. And I always saw it as this incredible example of someone who stepped into the role that she was born to embody and foster communal wealth through her growth and her dedication to healing. So
I can imagine you, little Brenna, in school singing a little song to the plants.
I swear it really was like that. Yeah,
that's adorable, and it's really telling of who you are today as well, because you're still connected to plants, right? You're still connected. And I remember you talked about your desire to grow some of your ancestral foodways, to be connected, but they won't grow here, right?
Yeah.
And how that's a sense of loss to some degree. So kind of related to the last question, you mentioned in some of our conversations before about how you're connected to Brazil through this love of ecology of plants. And I'm thinking of a story you told me about going to Brazil and meeting your family and being on the edge of a kind of, was it a jungle or a forest?
Yeah,
I don't remember.
The rainforest,
and
just
how
there on the side of town.
I love that story, and I was wondering if you could recreate it for our listeners today.
Sure. You can't see me, but I'm beaming thinking about my family. They're just incredible. But in general, when I travel, I feel like it's such a gift. I mean, it's a privilege to travel, right? And I consider it an incredible gift to be able to commune with the ecosystems of whatever area you visit. And in Brazil in particular, it's so special, or that experience was so special because, the Amazon rainforest is a literal food forest, right? You can see the work and the legacy of ancestors around you. You feel like I'm standing amongst their work. That day, my family, the town they live in Macapá, it's very generous to call it a city, I think. And it's a small town, a village. And the rainforest is right there, it's right on your backyard. And so I think they thought I was kind of silly, oh, Brenna wants to go into the forest. I'm no, I want to go in there. What's in there? So they finally,
they humored you.
Yeah, they humored me. They took me out and we did this walk through the forest. And at one point we walked into this huge grove of acai palms. And just thinking about it now, it struck me so strongly because they weren't there by accident. Someone sowed those seeds there. And now there was just this abundance of fruit waiting there to give its gift to us, and that's a staple food in our region. Now it's bougie. You can go to the cute health food store and get an acai bowl, but it's something that it's a critical food source in the north of Brazil. So yeah, it was just there were so many times like that where we just come across a tree and this fruit I'd never seen. There's one in particular that I remember seeing it and eating it, and I still don't know what it was called, but it was a gift there from our ancestors just living in the forest there. So yeah, it's really humbling, I think, to experience that, and it felt like a connection to our legacy walking through the forest. Yeah.
And that all of these experiences and all of these stories and these practices are drawing you in some way. It's powerful, I could tell. It leads you eventually to your dissertation research, right? Is that fair to say, or was it something else?
Yeah, so just briefly about my research. My work, I use mixed methods my goal is to find strategies for us to incorporate equity in green space planning here in Miami-Dade County. Across the county, there's historic legacies of like disinvestment and redlining that result in unequal access to environmental amenities or like green amenities like parks or tree cover. All these things that improve human well-being and will continue to improve our human well-being across the city as we grapple with climate change. And I think investing in improving the access and availability of those types of resources across the county is not only, it's a form of justice and a form of reparations as well. And I think I'm like taking my researcher hat off now, but I feel like we have a duty to right the wrongs of the past. And I don't know, I get some like flack from some professors that like, well, you're an academic, not an activist. I'm like, well, but we're living in this time of like unprecedented change and real serious issues of human rights and this collision of environmental issues and human social issues. And to work in a silo of just basic science or just ecology feels incomplete, and this might be controversial, but like irresponsible. Like so I felt a real duty to dedicate my life and my work to contributing to improving quality of life of all people in this city that I love, that's like held me and cared for me. So,
and that's the theme I hear a lot from you is this is a city that I love. And you love it, you want to stay here, right? And that's artist Catherine Holly's word. She left because she's like, the city is failing in some way. But you are here to say, I want to save it. And I want to make sure that there's some justice done, that there's restorative kind of justice almost, right? There's and in that justice, can you be a little bit more specific about what having more canopy cover is a form of justice? What is that for our listeners who are not maybe familiar with some of these terms or the issues at hand, how you're kind of coming at it through this kind of Indigenous perspective and love and
so climate change is like so multifaceted here in Miami, right? Like we're dealing not only with record-breaking heat index days and sea level rise, like climate change on these two different fronts. And I think we've talked a little bit about like slow emergencies. I feel like these are both slow emergencies where, there's enough time. Now we're having actually kind of the first cool weather day of the year.
Yes.
Yeah. A massive relief from this past summer, which has been sweltering, like
awful,
brutal heat. Yes. And, we're going to have a little break. And in between flooding days, we have some nice breaks, so there's opportunities for us to forget and to enjoy the good conditions, things when they're good. But those hot days are going to be back. Summer's going to come back and the rains are going to come back. And I don't have any wood to knock on, but eventually hurricanes are going to continue to proliferate. So I think we right now are in kind of a down point where we can continue as with this business as usual model, but that won't work forever. And I think plants present this really incredible resource and opportunity for addressing these two fronts of climate change that we have to contend with. Like we have to if we're going to continue to live here. And I intend to live here. So when it comes to canopy cover, more canopy cover means more shade, which means it's less hot. And, when it comes to flooding's a little bit more complicated, but our primary strategy in the county now is to use pumps to alleviate flooding. And I think that in ecology, we talk about resilience as a system with a lot of parts, or in like the way I think about it is like the spokes of a wheel. And the more of them you have, the more integral, the more healthy the wheel is, or the healthy the system is. But as you take the spokes away, you take the parts away, it becomes less and less resilient. And I think that resilient planning moving forward means we need to diversify our strategies. And depending on pumps is not a resilient strategy. You know, what if they fail? Eventually they will. And so using plants as a resource or a strategy of, okay, well, we can also depend on this other thing, stormwater swales, to prevent flooding or mitigate flooding, as well as pumps. So I feel complicated feelings about the use of pumps. They are critical infrastructure, but we can't only depend on this one strategy for dealing with flooding. Yeah, and so I just think, like, as far as like an Indigenous perspective, like thinking about risk, we have so much at risk right now, so much to lose in Miami. We're like ground zero for climate change, right? And I think it's really easy, or sometimes I find myself falling into the mentality of like doomism. Like there's these massive, complicated problems. Yeah, it's scary. You know, there's all these complicated feelings. And like Catherine had said, I understand feeling afraid and saying, you know, I'm leaving, you know, going somewhere where I feel safer. I get that. But Indigenous people across the planet have dealt with incredible loss all through history in the form of genocide and enslavement and forced assimilation and displacement. Yeah, all of these different fronts. And it helps me to remember that I am the descendant of survivors, and I'm a survivor too. And this is that's something we can get through together. I have to believe that. I have to believe that, because otherwise, what am I can't run away. And speaking about earlier about like not having a sense of place or something, Robin Wall Kimmerer wrote in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass.
Love that book.
It's an incredible book. Readers, read it because it's incredible. But one of the things that she wrote that really stuck with me was, she's a displaced person as well. And she talked about becoming Indigenous to place and kind of like sowing roots where you are. And this is my place now, you know, the Miami, South Florida, the Everglades are something I feel deeply connected to and love as part of my heart. And I can't give up. I just can't. I just can't. So yeah, I think remembering that we have and will continue to overcome adversity is a source of hope for me.
There's an Okinawan phrase. Just when you said that, it reminded me of something my family says a lot. It's just "nankuru naisa," which means it's an Okinawan, very indigenous phrase, saying. It's, you know, it doesn't have an exact translation, but it's something like, you know, it'll all be good, and it's this kind of constant outlook of like, we'll figure it out. You know, we've got to figure it out because we have to survive, right? And so. It's interesting hearing you talk about, you know, what resilience means to you, and it makes me think about all of the strategies Seminoles and Miccosukee have kept in place and continue to keep in place, and especially when it comes to the way that people grow, the way that people live in as caretakers of the earth. And, you know, I'm a part, and I know you are too, of all of these gardening communities. And it's funny to hear all these folks talk about, you know, all these new kind of regenerative soil and growing practices to permaculture and, you know, caring for the earth in this way, as if it's a new thing, you know. And I'm like, wow, you know, I think a lot of Indigenous folks have been practicing these things for quite some time and caring for the earth in a way that is already factoring in risk and are adapting in interesting and creative ways, but we don't always, I don't know, maybe it's the cynic in me, but I don't see the credit being given to them. And I know you worked in Fairchild in the Connect to Protect program, and as well as an educator there. Am I crazy? Or am I seeing that in a very cynical way, or is there some other spin to this, or no, another outlook?
I have a sometimes like unhealthy tendency to grant people grace and when maybe they don't deserve it. But I mean, I'm glad that those are conversations that are being had in botany and ecology and gardening communities, because they did them for a reason. You know, they're permaculture strategies, or whatever you want to call them, traditional ecological knowledge applied to cultivation. Those strategies work, and I'm glad that they're being used. I'm glad that the knowledge is being used. What bothers me is when traditional ecological knowledge or indigenous knowledge is treated as if like they just stumbled upon these solutions, you know, like
Right.
how cute or
Right.
something. It's like a little trite or something, or
Yes.
condescending or patronizing. And that's when it bothers me. It's like, just because it didn't fit into this like scientific lens of the empirical method, there's nothing, it's not valid knowledge or something. When it is. And just because maybe you don't understand how they came to these conclusions that these systems work, or it's not through a framework that you are trained in academia. I don't know. Yeah, that's what bothers me.
Yeah.
Like, I'm glad it's being used. I'm glad it's
Me
being
too.
done. We need to use these solutions and look back and learn. But yeah, I agree with that. That, yeah, credit in the form of like respecting that, yeah, they didn't just happen upon these things.
Right.
They were incredibly wise people implementing these solutions. So
they
let's just
studied the earth. They
Yeah.
understood.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a funny thing. So I love all of these conversations, and your work, kind of going back to some of your research and thinking about some of the people that you interviewed. Do you ever find yourself like, oh my gosh, I wish I could just correct this person I just interviewed right now? Does that ever happen while you're doing your dissertation field work?
Yeah. So just for context, some of the interviews that I do, I've interviewed a lot of people that work at the county level and that work in some degree to improve urban green spaces or like tree canopy. And yeah, I don't know if it's a generational thing or what, but what I sense in some of these interviews is like there are a lot of agencies that are working towards similar goals and for some reason are competing. And I came into academia, I think, and into adulthood with maybe a little bit of this idyllic vision that like we're better together, you know, like sometimes in interviews, I'm like, I don't understand. It sounds like you and this other person are saying the same things, but for some reason you don't like each other and you don't like working together. And I have experienced that in academia as well, where it's like, you know, the protectiveness around data or
Yes.
And that type of siloing is a barrier, I think, you know, a barrier to progress and to innovation. And I don't know, I've had a hard time reconciling that. And that's forthcoming in some of my work. So people look out for my manuscripts. But and, you know, and I talk a lot with my dad about this, that like this hegemony that gets in the way of progress. And I don't know what the solution is, you know. I think that I feel a little naive sometimes, especially when I talk to geographers who, like Kevin Grove, who has been thinking a lot about like resilient systems and adaptive management and panarchy and these concepts that originated because this has been an ongoing problem since the 60s, or as long as bureaucracy has been in existence. You know, there are always competing interests. And I don't know what the solution is. Sometimes I think like maybe things will change when I know people that I have come up in academia or like professionally with have similar ideas for me. So my hope is that slowly but surely we'll start pushing for these, I don't know, paradigm shift of collaboration over competition.
Yes.
And I don't know. I don't know the solution.
I don't either, because that's been an ongoing issue in our field. I mean, in academia in general.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. That's frustrating, especially when we are dealing with slow emergencies.
We don't have time to be petty.
We don't have time. We don't have time to be territorial over all this stuff. And it feels very urgent. I just want to end here on a couple of last points, and going back to that canopy cover. You had mentioned that by 2030 there was this aim to have about 30% of our city with some canopy cover of some sort. Mm-hmm. And you had mentioned this really interesting fact that a lot of the times when we have tree giveaways, they tend to be in areas that are or wealthier, more affluent areas. There's no incentive for renters, really. Mm. How do you get through to the city or to people in general, to our community at large, to rethink, the urgency in all of this, and why? What could be a good way to move past these blocks? This feels like a blockage that is in thinking and perspective and
So the county, Miami-Dade County, has a goal of reaching 30% canopy cover across the county, so across all of its census tracts. It's a really ambitious goal. As of now, I think the average is about 20%, and they have spoken about considering equity in the sense that they're prioritizing areas that are have 18% or less current canopy cover. And it seems like, those are often populations, historically redlined Black communities, who have experienced disinvestment. And there's so many complicated reasons for why there's lower tree canopy in those areas. One of the reasons is there's a high percentage of renter-occupied homes, like you said. And if I am a renter, and I don't have control of what happens in my yard. My landlord does. And a landlord doesn't have an incentive or reason to invest, especially in trees, on their property, because it represents a cost. It does. Like, the reality is trees are costly to maintain, considering
you gotta cut them.
Hurricanes come, you need to come down, or you need to maintain the greenfall. And I know a lot of the people that work in this sector in the county, and I have a lot of respect for them, but what worries me is the focus on the tree giveaway strategy, which I think is great. Like, they get great turnout. There's a lot of interest in it. But to participate in those, it requires you to own your home. It requires you to have a car to be able to go there, to pick up the supplies, and to go home. So although I hear, on paper, the goal is we're going to target these communities that don't have equitable access to this resource, but the strategy doesn't align with that. So I also think that those types of programs shift the responsibility of attaining that goal away from the county to private homeowners. And as I said, it's costly to maintain trees. So I mean, if I had my way, it would be like, we need to shift and invest in street trees and public right-of-way trees and greening our parks, which the Parks Department here in Miami-Dade County is putting a lot of effort into greening our parks. It's a great initiative, but I think the opportunity really lies in street trees, and that would be a strategy that takes the onus away from just individuals. And if we talk about like climate change, right? Like, there's this. I'm glad that there's more awareness of the issues with measures like the carbon footprint, which say your carbon footprint's too high. You need to work on that if you care about climate change. Like, well, actually, what about those 10 companies or however many that are contributing most to climate change? So this, I think, is a strategy. Although it is effective, people like it. It makes it so, well, we're trying to reach this goal. You, private homeowner, take a tree and contribute to this, which is, like we said, it's a spoke of the wheel. It should be a spoke of the wheel in a suite of strategy that we use to reach this goal. And that's what I hope to see in the future, is a shift away from just focusing on those types of strategies and expanding and being creative and imaginative about what the future of our city looks like.
Yeah, it's funny that we've talked before about a lot of speculative fiction and Afrofuturism, and how, sometimes we can find ways to think through these solutions with an Indigenous perspective, with a Black perspective, with a different, more creative lens to get to these really difficult, complicated, very nuanced issues. These are historical. There's a whole genealogy of violence that is hard to get through maybe at a city meeting, right? But that was all I was thinking of when you were talking about all of these throughout this conversation, these different ways to tackle.
Yeah, and also
change.
Adapting, right? Have you read Disposable City? I think it's the final chapter. Just kind of envisions a future of Miami when I think there's 6 feet of sea level rise and what it would look like. And it's not scary.
It's not?
Yeah.
Okay. It sounds terrifying.
It's from the perspective of someone who's coming here on kind of a eco-tourist who wants to see the flooded streets of Miami, and is being shown around by a tour guide of someone whose family has stayed in Miami and has lived here for generations. And I don't know, it was a really hopeful way of thinking about something that, yes, feels very scary and uncertain. The book I was thinking of was Rebecca Solnit's Paradise Built in Hell.
Yes.
Brutal name, but that was something that, when I was going through this doomist crisis, really helped me out of it, to see that, terrible times can come and we can be there for one another and care for one another and lift each other out of these disasters. I think the examples she uses were Hurricane Katrina and the San Francisco fires, and had these incredible stories about people just coming together and deciding to love and care for one another in the face of disaster. And those give me a lot of hope. I think, not to talk about media a lot, but especially when we think about sci-fi media and visions of the future that television or movies show to us, they emphasize the worst in people. And I choose to believe that the best in people comes out in the face of hardship. And that's what history shows, that when the going gets tough and people need to come together, they do. And I choose to believe that that's what the future will look like.
Oh, that's a beautiful way to end. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Mitzi. It's been a pleasure. It's what a great conversation. So many, you got me thinking about a lot. So thank you.
Thank you. And that's our show. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about the Commons for Justice and to listen to our other episodes, go to commonsforjustice.fiu.edu. If you'd like to learn more about the Global Indigenous Forum or more about this podcast, Unblocked, please follow us on Instagram at FIU_GIF or go to our website, indigenous.fiu.edu. This episode was produced by me, Mitzi Uehara Carter. The audio engineer is Gabriel Marchisio Jr. The audio and post-production editing was done by Sebastian Rocha Alvarez. And associate producer and audio editing is Diane Benitez. Thank you to the Mellon Foundation's Just Future initiatives for their support on this podcast.